I'm Yolande Strengers. I'm an associate professor here at Monash University in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab and the unofficial host for the Q&A session today for our debate that we held last year on whether AI is inclusive. I'd just like to start by inviting everybody to take a moment to acknowledge the country that they're on today, recognising that we're all on many different countries at the moment, given that most of us are sitting in our own homes. Myself am on the Bunurong country of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So today is an opportunity to ask questions to a number of us who were at the debate last year, and also we have an extra special guest joining us as well who is able to answer your questions on whether AI is inclusive. So hopefully you've had a chance to watch the replay. We won't be reliving the debate today. We're not sitting on one side or the other like we were last year. We're just here to answer questions and also to hear your thoughts and comments on whether AI is inclusive. So there is, you can use the chat function if you sort of want to chat amongst yourselves and to keep a discussion going that way. That's one way of participating. The way to get through to us, because there are so many of you, is to use the Q&A box down the bottom of your screens, and that's where questions will be popping up, and we'll be able to see those through. We've got some people behind the scenes there helping us to filter those questions back up to us so we can answer them and enter the discussion with you that way. So that's how it will work. I need to let you know that you're all being recorded, but we're not recording your any personal details, your video, or any identifying features. So just to let you know that that's happening. And the motivation behind this debate, just to give a bit of more context again, was AI is a field that is constantly under scrutiny for being inequitable and being not being inclusive. But there are obviously always two sides to these things, and there's many sides. And we wanted to really thrash out some of the perspectives last year, and we thought the debate format would be a really great way of doing that, kind of basically forcing us to take one position or the other, and to talk about the various issues around biases, cultural, social, gender biases, and other inclusivity issues around AI. And that was why we decided to go with that. We unfortunately ran out of time last year, so that's partly motivated having this Q&A session this time around and opening it up to a broader range of perspectives. So I'll just introduce you briefly to the speakers we have here today. So I've introduced myself. I'm, as I said, Associate Professor in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab. I'm also Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in our Faculty of IT here at Monash. With me today is Dr. Aldeida Aleti, sorry. And Aldeida was also joined me on the affirmative team at the debate last year. So Aldeida is a senior lecturer in cybersecurity systems and has a focus on automated software engineering. So she'll be bringing that perspective into the discussion today. And we're also joined by Associate Professor Dorin. Alan wasn't at the debate last year, but has amazing experience and expertise in this field. And we'll be bringing in a new perspective today because Alan's expertise, he's in the Department of Data Science and AI, and he actually looks at inclusivity issues around the environment and nature. So he's going to be bringing that perspective into what was a very human-centred debate last year, and to answer some questions around that as well. So I think that's it from me. I'll start by opening it up just with a broad question to all of us. And that is just to offer each of us an opportunity to give our reflections on the debate from last year, and if there's anything, and particularly for you, Alan, bringing in your perspective to this issue, and kind of giving us a bit of an overview of what you might have to say about that today. So I'll start with Aldeida. Do you want to let us know how did you how have things been since the debate for you, and what are your reflections since then?
Thank you, Yolande, and thank you for inviting me again to this debate. Well, it's not a debate, but I think it's wonderful to have another opportunity to think about the debate, reflect on it. Because when you invited me to be in the debate, I was on the side, before being in the debate, I was on the side that AI is not inclusive. there are so many examples that we can see, in the news. There is so many news about what the horrible things that AI is causing, such as, for instance, there was the example of this commercial risk assessment software, Compass, that really is performing worse than humans and is more biased than humans and less inclusive. So, and there's so many other examples of AI used in non-inclusive ways. But being in the debate forced me to look for those other examples, the good examples that maybe people don't hear much about because they're not as newsworthy perhaps, and really made me see the good sides of AI. And I do research on software testing and how we can test AI for fairness and bias. So I've been, I am in the midst of that, and I mostly deal with the bad examples. And that's why I was on the side of, AI is not inclusive, but there's wonderful examples out there where AI is very inclusive. So I came out of the debate with a different point of view. I'm still a bit on the fence. I'm still a bit on the fence, but more positive than I was before.
Great. And Alan, what are your kind of thoughts on the debate and the perspectives that we perhaps didn't cover last year?
Thanks, Yolande. It was great to watch the debate. I wasn't able to attend, unfortunately, but I watched it on the video. And as you mentioned in the introduction, actually, the most obvious thing to me is the human-centric approach that everyone on the debating panel took on both sides. And yet, from my perspective and the perspective of my research, we're a part of a larger system. And if anything is evidence of that, the fact that we're all sitting here self-isolating and we're worried about a pandemic that's emerged from probably bats has made the issue much clearer to all of us, I hope, that it's not wise and almost nonsensical for us to consider ourselves in isolation and to not take into account the interactions that our software and hardware has between humans in social and human systems and populations, but also to look at the interactions that our technology has with the planet at large. And a big part of that is to look at terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems and to try and understand how our technology is usually, but not always, negatively impacting on those. And I suppose the other thing that comes out from my perspective, or the perspective taken by researchers in my field, is when we look at the human interactions with AI and the changes that we see wrought in the human population, it's possible for us to focus just on the functional aspects of AI, like what it does. When you look, though, at the environment as a whole, it's not just what it does that makes AI important to consider. It's how it's made, what it's made from, and where the technology ends up when it's obsolete. And that kind of full cycle really needs to be considered if you're going to take an environmental perspective.
Absolutely. And that's also something that I've been considering in my research as well, with digital voice assistants. One of the arguments I was making last year was that they cloak their the devices are cloaked in sort of likability, and that's maintained through femininity, which is obviously where the gender bias and gender issues come from. But that also encourages us to accept them and to like them and to think that they're doing good in the world. But behind that, as you say, is a very vast train of impacts on the planet, and also inequitable labour issues in terms of who's making these devices, and also at the other end, who gets to use them, who has access to internet, who has access to electricity, who has access to technology. So I think they're all really important issues to bring into this conversation, this debate as well. And they are often overlooked. We tend to focus on the impacts of the technology itself rather than the back end and the end, if you like, of where all this stuff ends up, and as well. All right, so I might just see what questions we have, and please do keep adding them to the Q&A section there, so we get to address the issues that you might have for us. So, all right, I'll ask this one to us. What are some examples of inclusive AI that we're seeing today? Anyone like to have a go at that one?
Go on, Aldeida.
Well, I can bring in one example. Well, there's many, of course, but I think where AI has been very successful is to make the world more accessible to people with different abilities. And one example that comes to mind is this cane that was developed by a visually impaired person, which had Google Maps in it, so they can use to navigate in cities, and makes it much easier for people with visual impairments to access the city in better ways. That's one example that comes to mind.
From my perspective, actually, it's almost always a double-edged sword. And so if you identify something, for instance, species classification, camera trapping IDs, you can use machine learning and AI techniques to better understand the data about the distribution of species and biodiversity in ecosystems. You can use the same kind of techniques to identify images in camera traps, and therefore to improve your monitoring of ecosystems, and therefore to assess better their health and to assess the impacts of our changes on ecosystems. But as I said before, I always wonder about the bigger picture. And in this case, if people are installing camera traps and they're running machine learning algorithms, often remotely, on high-performance computing equipment that is running on electricity, that is generated by sources that are burning carbon, then we have this cycle where we're trying to improve a small focused aspect of the ecosystem by monitoring it or conserving it or managing it in some way. And we're using this new technology, but we're not weighing up the overall cost on the planet's ecosystem. So if we continue to run deep learning and machine learning, other machine learning algorithms on these high performance machines, and we're not thinking about the energy expenditure and the carbon emissions, whilst we might be trying to save this species and this ecosystem, overall as a planet we're actually destroying the systems on which they depend, and we're disrupting things like the climate and their supplies of water, nutrients and other things to manufacture the devices that we're then using to say we're saving the ecosystems or monitoring. So it's always a very difficult thing to balance, but I don't think we look carefully enough at it. So whilst I'll say there are many positives, people making amazing discoveries using machine learning and AI, avoiding or eliminating pests and invasive species using AI and monitoring, there's always this flip side to it, which is really concerning.
Absolutely. So I guess from my perspective, we have a project that we've been working on in our lab, which is about giving older people access to smart home technologies. And fortunately, we got all these technologies. It's also in partnership with Maclean Care and Deakin University, I should say. And we got all these technologies into people's homes earlier in the year before COVID-19 sort of hit. And it's been really fascinating to see, particularly how Google Home has really kind of been integrated into these people's lives. And we're just sort of starting to see the effects of that. So I think that there's some really, really positive inclusion benefits that are going to come out of that project about using some of those devices and giving people confidence to access various kind of services and even entertainment, but also to reach out to family and friends during this time. So while, and I'm with you too, Alan, I think there's always two sides to this. There's certainly some problems as well with the type of information that devices like Google Home provide to people. But there is also some positive impacts, particularly when we're all isolated in our homes, and voice assistants can actually kind of connect us with people maybe in ways that haven't been possible before. And particularly for this older cohort, that's potentially really important. So that's a new kind of example that's come to my attention just recently as a result of the crisis we're in at the moment. We'll have more to say about that later in the year as well. Okay, I'll raise another question for us, just come through the Q&A line. So yeah, these are great. Please keep them coming. Yeah. Who in your opinion or our opinion is responsible for training the developers, creating the AI to remove biases? Yeah. Or how can they be better informed? This is a really great question. I think it's a really, really important question, and one that we've all thought about in different ways. My perspective on this is that we need to get more social scientists involved in the development of advanced technology. So, I'm a sociologist, but I'm in an IT faculty, and all the researchers in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab are social scientists of some description. And there are a number of other emerging labs happening, around the world now that are bringing social sciences much more into the forefront of thinking about advanced technologies. And that for me is one part of the answer, not just about training technologists to be more ethical or to have a better understanding of the social, but to actually, understand technology as a social science, technology development as a social science, and recognise that we need, that building AI and developing AI is not just a technical discipline. It actually, it's not that there's sociologists informing it. I think sociologists actually be involved, and all social sciences should be involved in creating it. So that's, I think, one way of thinking about that. And there's some great examples of university groups around the world that are starting to bring those expertises together in their training programs. Alan or Aldeida, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely agree with you, Yolande. And also as a software developer or software engineer, I can talk from that other side of things. I don't think we have a good understanding of what's inclusive and what's fairness. And there's so many definitions out there. And when we develop these technologies, I don't think we think much about fairness and inclusion. We think mainly about performance, we think about throughput and those other quality attributes that are more about how, whether the software delivers the functionality that is intended to do. But I think inclusion and fairness should be one of the things, or one of the main things that we think about. And interestingly, when we talk about AI, so the code that implements an AI algorithm is usually less than 10% of the whole software system. There are many other parts of the software system that are not the AI algorithm itself. So it's how you engineer the data, how you pre-process, post-process, how you present the data and to the user interaction, those other parts. And I think the conversation so far has mainly focused on that AI algorithm, data bias, algorithm bias, and we don't talk much about those other parts. So how do we train developers for creating the AI to remove bias? It's a very difficult question. And I think, Yolande answered that. And I think that's very, it will definitely help us to get developers think more about these things. But how can they be better informed? My work is focused on this part. And from my point of view, I'm looking at the testing. So how do we test? How do we test whether a system is biased or not, or is fair or not, or is inclusive or not? And in a way, you need to involve the human in that process. And it's only us that can tell whether the AI is biased or not, but we may be biased, and those biases may be unconscious. So we need some sort of interactive system where AI is telling us, oh, look, this output seems to be biased. What do you think? And maybe that can make us think, oh, maybe there is some bias there. So AI in other ways is helping us to identify biases that we didn't know existed or are unconscious. So I think it needs to be this kind of interactive process that needs to happen with the AI.
I'd probably add another point, I suppose, to the discussion. I don't think it's going to be generally possible to identify biases at the stage of development. I think many of them emerge only at the application side. And so what I think would probably be the ideal scenario is that there's a kind of best practice, if you like, for application of these technologies in different domains. If you identify biases in a particular system when you're, training an automated vehicle, you're going to find different biases in the same piece of software when you apply it in a different context that may not have been apparent before or may not have been relevant before. And from my experience, having done this and having had researchers work with me who are doing this, we're frequently taking software developed for one application and applying it in the domain of ecology, ecosystem monitoring, and so on. And so I see every day that what works in one scenario can be applied elsewhere, but you'll establish or identify different biases and different issues arise. So I think really at the application end would be a good time to start discussing the very specific biases that are really going to only appear at that point in time and couldn't have been predicted prior. And I'm not just talking about social issues. Of course, if we're moving into the environmental issues, then that's a major problem. And a really good example I kind of recently studied is the development of micro drones for applications in pollination of crops. And these tiny little drones are about the size of a coin, and they're intended to replace bees, honeybees often, where the environmental degradation or the use of pesticides or other issues that we've introduced has damaged the kind of wild bee population or has made it impossible to introduce and sustain populations of managed honeybees. And these micro drones seemingly one day may be able to pollinate the crops, only if you're a technologist. No ecologist believes that's possible. And there are so many reasons why it won't work. And there are so many reasons why the cure is way worse than actually the thing that we're trying to solve, that you wouldn't want to introduce trillions of these things to the environment anyway. Without the ecological expertise at the application end, no one would have noticed.
Great. So we don't have a lot of time left. We've got about 6 minutes left. I'm just wondering if maybe we could have a look and pick a question for each of us to answer. There's one there that I think I can answer, which is about the example of Tay from Microsoft, which got brought up a couple of times in the debate last year, and about how we protect AI from harassment. This is actually something that Jenny Kennedy and I focus on extensively in our book that's coming out later in this year called The Smart Wife. And we have a chapter actually called Bitches with Glitches, which is all about the abuse and the harassment that various devices face from people and what we can do about it. There's just one example that I'll mention from there that I think is really best practice in this regard, and it's actually a banking chatbot called Kai, which was developed by Jacqueline Feldman, who is a sort of, I guess she's a feminist chatbot designer. And Jacqueline designed Kai to be respectful, to be have dignity. So she had these kind of qualities that she wanted to instill in the technology, and I think it's a really interesting example of how this can be done. And what that means in practice is that Kai will shut down if you abuse it. Kai will not tolerate bad behaviour. It will resist kind of being gendered. So she actually designed it as a bot rather than a gendered device, and she gave it a distinct bot personality. So she tried to kind of get around this anthropomorphizing problem that we have with a lot of these devices, where we want to treat them as either male or female, by thinking about what a bot is like, what a bot personality should be, and then allowing that device to respond in that way. It still has its own personality. It's a really interesting example that I encourage you to check out as a kind of one way to deal with that. I can suggest questions for you, Aldeida or Alan, but if there's one in there that you want to grab for yourselves.
Can I grab one that I saw?
Sure.
It's with AI already being adopted, how do we reset AI with a blank slate? That's a good question. My view on that is that we're still at its infancy. So I think we still have that blank slate. One example that I brought in the debate was this example of toilets, on how, we've kind of have a view of toilets. And now when we build toilets for people with other abilities, we just put some add-ons, but not think about their requirements from the design. So I think because AI is so new, although it has developed so fast and it's really doing some wonderful things now, I think we still have the opportunity to. It is still a blank slate, in my opinion, and we have recognized these issues early on, so we can address them, and we can think about how we can solve these issues. One of them is having diverse teams and diverse views. So we design an AI that is for everybody. So I think I do believe it's still a blank slate.
Okay, I'll pick a question as well. Jaden's asked, what are some ways we can address AI bias without implementing our own bias? Look, a few things spring to mind. Sometimes I'd say a diverse community, a diverse group of developers and those responsible for applying the AI provide the diverse views that you're looking for. And as long as we're kind of keeping in mind that diversity the whole way along the development, implementation, if you like, and application of AI, and those voices are heard and not just given kind of lip service to, then I think we can certainly manage this, even in the environmental sphere. Another quick point I'd like to raise is, look, some of our biases are good, in my opinion, and I don't want to turn the world into a kind of a completely rational decision-making process where machines are telling us what's the best thing to do. And our values as humans, the diversity of our cultural backgrounds and opinions really matters. And as long as there is that diversity and it's not just one group taking charge, then those kinds of biases should be thrashed out, discussed, and we will come up with new, better ways of getting along. And if AI can help us do that, then that to me would be an amazing thing, worthwhile.
Absolutely, and that actually kind of helps answer another question that's at the end there by Ernesto around, if inclusivity is incorporated into the end goal of a particular AI development, at which part do we, should inclusivity be incorporated without hindering the entire development process? And I think you kind of partly answered that there, Alan. I think it can be part of the whole process and should be part of the whole process. I think part of the issue we have is that it's often considered at the end or as an afterthought, or once we realise that there's a bias or a problem. So many of the developments that I've seen in the digital voice assistant and smart home space have arisen because they've been released into the world and then we realise that there's a problem with them. And I understand not all of those can be anticipated. All of those issues can be anticipated. But I suspect a lot more can be than we are currently accounting for now. Do either of you have any, we're out of time, do either of you have any last words you'd like to say?
I'd just like to say it's very promising technology, and as I think came out of the debate and the discussion just now, it's up to us to make it work. It's not going to work by itself, and developers, those applying the technology, those funding the technology, and those purchasing it as consumers all have a voice that needs to consistently push for inclusivity. And as long as that push is apparent, then you hope we can find a way through. But if we neglect to make that push and call out biased or undesirable software, or those using it in undesirable ways, we're doomed. So we should really pay attention. None of us can afford to let it slide.
One last thing that I can say is that AI is our own creation, and in a way is a mirror of ourselves, of how we think. So I really do believe it will help us become better humans and more inclusive, because we can see ourselves in this outer thing that we can test and we can understand, and so it will make much easier for us in the future to identify biases and in ourselves and improve ourselves as well.
Let's hope so. All right, well, thank you, Aldeida and Alan, for for joining me today and being part of this debate. And thank you all for your participation and for posting your questions and comments online. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. Obviously, this is an ongoing conversation and discussion, and we'll be certainly having more events, I imagine, around this topic, and we're all doing related research. So we'll be part of other conversations as well, and as I'm sure all of you will be in your own lives and businesses or careers as well. So thank you very much, and we'll see you some other time.